It's the Sittin Sportside podcast.
Can't wait.
With Cody Marshall.
Did you just get here? Can you give him your notes?
And Eric Hanman.
I have dedicated my life to this team, okay?
Exclusively on 1045theteam.com.
And welcome into the podcast. I'm Eric Hanman right here on 1045theteam.com, joined, which seems to be almost as always at this point, by Cody Marshall.
Hey, I'm the new fixture here. Consistency. You got to have that. Good teams are consistent.
Yes, sir.
That's why the New England Patriots win so much.
Now you don't have to bring that up.
All right.
All
Well,
right.
I'm just telling you. That's what it is.
You just soured my mood for the podcast, to be quite honest. But you know what would be sour is if your favorite NHL team loses some of your favorite players, because we're coming up in about a few days now. We're going to have the expansion draft. We're in draft season. MLB draft just happened. The NHL draft, the actual draft, is coming up, as well as the NBA draft. And then the expansion draft for the Vegas Golden Knights. That's coming up on the 21st, right?
Yeah.
So this podcast is dedicated to talking about the expansion draft in the NHL and talking about certain players who might be available. And I know Cody's got some off-the-top type thoughts on this.
So the way it works, the Vegas Golden Knights have 30 picks, one per each NHL team that's already been established. Each team had the opportunity to protect either 9 or 11 players. There was two situations. You could go a 7-3-1, which was protecting 7 forwards, 3 defensemen, 1 goalie. Or you could do 8-1, which was 8 players in general out on the ice, a mix of defensemen, mix of forwards, and 1 goalie. Now, some teams, most teams, preferred to go with a 7-3-1. One of the teams that went with the 8-1 was, of course, the runner-up, the Nashville Predators, because their strength came from the blue line. They had a lot of good defensemen that they didn't want to let go and put up on the market for the opportunity for the Golden Knights to take. So as a result, James Neal, one of the biggest names in the NHL right now, is exposed for the opportunity to go to Vegas and probably be the headline guy there, depending on who they get.
Yeah.
And also, everybody's already talking about how the goaltender for the Vegas Golden Knights is shaping up to be Marc-Andre Fleury, because the Pittsburgh Penguins, as soon as they won the title, asked him to waive his no-movement clause so that they could in turn protect Matt Murray, the young guy who now came up through the system at Wilkes-Barre Scranton and now it has won 2 Stanley Cups. So it makes sense. Certainly you want your youth in the organization, and the Pittsburgh Penguins have pretty much said, look, Matt Murray's our guy of the future, and we wish Marc-Andre Fleury the best, but we think he's going to be the next goalie of the Vegas Golden Knights. What I think is interesting, we already
What about the Red Wings goalie, Peter
Mrazek? Well, Mrazek protected, right?
No, they're keeping Jimmy Howard now, which to me, you talk about youth movement. They decided to keep the older, savvy vet and expose Mrazek. Possibly he could be the goalie of the future. Maybe Fleury would be the what do you call it? The strong side of the platoon for the first few couple of years. Maybe they'll take him as well.
It's tough. Right now, I think Detroit, they must have looked at each other as an organization and been like, I don't think it matters who we protect as a goalie, because neither one of them have been impressive. Every year we go into it, Peter Mrazek is everybody's pick to be the better goalie, and
8 years older.
And that's what I'm saying.
Jimmy
Howard had some good years, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 years ago. Since then, it's literally you're darned if you do and you're darned if you don't, because Mrazek when he has bad nights, they are bad.
Right.
And when he has good nights,
his save percentage this past year was .908.
And you look at what he's done in the postseason. The Detroit Red Wings single-handedly lost the series to the Tampa Bay Lightning the second time because of a mistake that Peter Mrazek made. And it ended up being a 1-0 game. Alex Killorn ends up scoring because Mrazek misplays a puck behind the net. And so
that's your Lightning, right?
Yeah, and that's what I was getting to. The biggest move so far of the offseason involving trades is the Lightning sending Jonathan Drouin to the Montreal Canadiens in exchange for a draft pick, but also a prospect in defenseman Mikhail Sergachev. And it turns out this happened, and I think the logic by Steve Yzerman is smart, because this is if you looked at the Washington Post put out a nice article that basically listed who they felt were going to be the picks from every single team. At the time, Jonathan Drouin was protected by the Tampa Bay Lightning, and the pick was Vladislav Nemesnikov. With Drouin gone, the Tampa Bay Lightning have now protected Vladislav Nemesnikov, and going through the list, I would have to think that the pick would probably be...
Who is it going to be, Cody?
Maybe a Slater Cuckoo or a Cedric Paquette. I mean, not the names have. You're looking at a Boston Bruin kind of situation where they're picking Malcolm Subban as their backup goalie because Boston has protected all of their good players. Is what it seems like. So it's a smart move on the part of Steve Yzerman, but this is going to shape up to be a fun draft. I think we're going to see a good mix of role players and some stars that are just the contract's too big, and
a team people seem to be getting on for like this either protection and the lackluster possible research or whatever the planning for it is the Minnesota Wild, because now they're exposing Eric Stahl, who had a great season last year, obviously a little bit older, 32 years old, so they're going to protect Zucker because he's 7 years younger. There's the youth theory there, but they also expose their defensemen Marco Scandella and Matt Duba, so they're possibly going to lose one of those, if not both of those guys, as a defenseman. And you look at teams like the Islanders; they're protecting 5 defensemen, and like you mentioned earlier in the podcast about the Predators doing a similar thing to keep their blue line in check. So I think though the Wild are a team that people are going to be questioning on this expansion draft, and a lot of the former Wild could be in Vegas.
Well, and this is a team that we all thought probably should have had at least a Stanley Cup appearance by now, if not the Cup itself, especially with Zach Parise, Jason Palmville. They got him at the height of his career, and they just have not put it together.
And Dubnyk has been pretty darn good.
And Dubnyk has been. I mean, I think he had half a year that didn't go so smooth, and they've had so much trouble at the goalie position with him, and at the time there was Josh Harding, who obviously has multiple sclerosis, so he had trouble staying healthy. But I think there's torn between, look, we've got the pieces, but they're not producing, and maybe it's time we start over kind of thing. Keep Zach Parise, but then try to build around him again with younger guys. And it's a tough situation. Now, going back to Nashville, we talked about how James Neal is available, and the biggest dilemma there was you're looking at James Neal and Cale Yarncroke as the two guys who were probably going to be exposed. Yarncroke's younger and only makes $2 million, so it's not as big as a cap hit to the Predators. Obviously, with that kind of situation, you're going to expose Neal, but now they're also talking if for whatever reason Nashville decides, hey, we actually want to save Neal and protect him, you're now opening up Colton Sissons, who had a great Stanley Cup final. We looked at him as a role player, but he came on and he should have had a goal in Game 5, but it was waved off because the referee blew the whistle way too early because he couldn't see the puck, even though it was clearly loose in the crease.
Yeah.
And this is the guy who had a hat trick to beat Anaheim in the deciding game to send him to the Stanley Cup playoffs. So it's a really interesting situation to have for Nashville coming off of your best season in franchise history, where now you're going to lose a key piece, whether it be James Neal, Yarncroke, or Colton Sissons.
Yeah, and another thing too, though, is we just routed off a bunch of good players, so they only do get 30 picks, right? And they can only take 2 goalies, probably.
I mean, you could probably take as many as you want, but obviously you probably go a max of 3, maybe,
right?
But at least 2.
Yeah, so they have a lot of, I think, players. So there's going to be teams that may have exposed. Maybe they're risking that the player that they're exposing who might be someone that they don't want to lose, maybe they're banking on someone else having a better player. You know what I'm saying? Like, we're questioning what they're doing, but at the same time, they're banking on possibly the Vegas Golden Knights not necessarily thinking that they need that player possibly, or certain contract situations. Maybe it could come into play too, right? Do you think
right,
like a player with more money on his contract, they're not going to want to take that on right away?
Exactly, especially as an expansion team. You got to balance it. You want enough guys who are, I'm not going to say superstars, but you certainly want guys who aren't just role players.
How does their draft work? Did they get a draft pick this year, or is it just the expansion draft?
I would assume you've got to have. I would assume they draft
because I know the Devils definitely have the first pick.
Right, but I'm assuming that they've got to have draft picks because what are you going to do about your AHL affiliate?
Right.
You're not. It's not like we're just a team didn't move. This is the Atlanta Thrashers moving up, picking up and moving to Winnipeg.
No, okay. They're expanding their AHL team coming up. Wow, I don't know.
Or are they going to play a year without? Because I haven't heard anything in reference to a new AHL team coming either. So I don't know.
They might wait a year. Who knows?
This is going to be interesting. And then we're probably going to do it in a couple more years if Quebec or someone gets another team.
Try to even this up at some point. You said Quebec City?
I think that it makes no sense to not put it anywhere.
Right.
Put it anywhere else. This is Canada. Their love for the game is obviously much greater than the United States.
Right.
But look at look at the fan base you've got in Montreal. You're then creating another rivalry right in the same province if you put a team in Quebec. I mean, right now you're looking at Ottawa, Montreal, Toronto. We love those games, especially this year you had Ottawa, all three of them, make the playoffs. And after a year where no Canadian team made it to the playoffs.
Yeah.
So I just think it'd be great for competitive balance, but also
the Beebs, right?
But now your problem is you're having too many teams. This league is messed up in a way because you've got 16 teams in the Eastern Conference, 14 in the Western Conference. Yeah. So if you put a team, you're going to put Vegas in the West, so you got 16, 15.
Can you just humor me for a second here? Oh, you're right. You're right. So now it's going to be 16,
15. So if you put a team in Quebec, you either got to do one of two things. You're either going to be back at 17, 15, or
no. See, that's
Detroit or Columbus has got to go out west.
They already fixed the divisions like 2 years ago, and then they still messed it up. They can't do that again.
Well, everybody's problem right now is...
the Detroit Red Wings were in the Western Conference for a longest time. They might as well should have just stayed there, but they had to be like all regional on us and put them back in the...
But it makes sense. Why would you have...
I understand that, but they should have just left it.
Why did the Indianapolis Colts play in the AFC South for football? I don't know about you. I don't consider Indiana to be a southern state.
Come up with a new name for these divisions. You know, like, geez.
They kind of did the Atlantic, the Pacific. Right, so they've regionalized it some more, but it makes sense. They're trying to help it make sense, but like I said, Detroit,
New Orleans Pelicans. I mean, are they really in the West? Are they really? Is New Orleans? I mean, I know it's more in the is it the Midwest? They're close to Texas. I get it, but like, they're close enough to me on the East for being an East Coast team. Now we're just talking.
And then Oklahoma City, they're moving close to the line.
Right.
Seattle was definitely Western Conference.
They were, yeah, right, exactly. Well, my favorite thing about this is completely off topic. My favorite thing about 2K is when you do change your team, they will fix it.
Realign the divisions.
They realign the divisions. And so it's interesting to see which teams they put. So I put a team in, I think it was Hartford, Connecticut. And so they ended up moving Milwaukee to the Western Conference.
That's interesting. How about the Madden? One of the Maddens, if you do a franchise, within the first 2 years, the Rams up and moved to Toronto. But I think he's still playing the NFC West with the Niners, Seahawks, and Arizona.
They're not as clever.
The EA Sports didn't quite get some memo on that one.
2K Sports, little thumbs up from the Sittin Sportside podcast on that one.
But I just want to look.
Any other thoughts?
I know we've got a lot of Rangers fans in the area, so I'm just going to go over who they protected. So who can't be picked is going to be Kevin Hayes, Chris Kreider, JT Miller, Rick Nash, Derek Stepan, Mika Zibanejad, Matt Zuccarello, Nick Holden, Ryan McDonough, Mark Stahl, and Rick Lundqvist. The unprotected players, so these are all the guys that Vegas would have a shot at taking, are going to be Taylor Beck, Chris Brown, Daniel Catenacci, Jesper Foss, Tanner Glass. I think Foss is the one that's going to go. If I'm with Vegas, he's leaving the team.
I would take him.
I mean, other than that, not a whole lot of guys that stand out. Magnus Hellberg, Antti Ranta, but it's going to be
Lindbergh,
like
maybe?
I said, it's going to be interesting to see who goes. Who are you worried about for your Sharks?
Well, we kind of talked a little bit about this pre-show. That Joe Thornton's on the unprotected list, but I thought he might have been a free agent, so I'm not exactly 100% sure. But I am worried about Joel Ward a little bit. I'm not sure he's good enough for 30 picks. I'm not sure he's good enough for that 30. So, like, as a Sharks fan, I'm nervous. And then also, too, I was nervous about Paul Martin, but I'm looking at a lot of other good defensemen out there, so maybe I'm feeling a little more comfortable with that one as well. So, I guess there's really nothing. This shouldn't be. I guess it's a good job by the front office. or I'm a little skittish about the future.
The
Bodker, right?
Bodker is the pick for the Washington Post. They said that Bodker would end up going to Vegas.
I'm also nervous about him.
The picks for the Washington Post, they listed out by teams. Anaheim, the pick was Sami Vatanen, which I think is a great defenseman pick. Luke Schenn from the Coyotes. Malcolm Subban from the Bruins. Linus Ullmark from the Sabres. So I guess they are.
Is Subban going to be a good goalie?
I don't know. I figured he'd be the backup at Boston by now. I mean, I know he's made a couple trips up to the parent club, but he just hasn't stuck around. And you've got Tuukka Rask and who's their backup now? My friend Claudia's going to hate me for this one because I don't remember who their backup is, but
it's not good enough to remember.
I mean, you go through the list. Then Calgary, it's Curtis Lazar, Lee Stempniak from Carolina, Chicago. Trevor Van Riemsdyk was the pick from the Blackhawks.
This is who's on Washington Post.
Colorado, Mikhail Grigorenko.
Interesting.
Cody Eakin of the Dallas Stars. Josh Anderson from Columbus.
So you're not getting a lot of names that we mentioned, though. So
no.
That's interesting.
In fact, the Red Wings pick was Xavier Ouellet, who's a young 23-year-old. He's a restricted free agent. Griffin Reinhart from the Edmonton Oilers, and that's a team that has a bunch of young guys who have now started to contribute and gotten them into the playoffs. Jason Demers from the Panthers. Braden McNabb from the Los Angeles Kings. They must have...
This guy seems to be picking a player per team, I guess.
Which is what they're going to do.
Okay.
So
a team... Are you not allowed to pick more than one person from a team?
Right.
Oh, that is. You said that at the top, didn't you?
Yeah.
Okay. Well,
but you don't listen to me. This is what we've learned in these podcasts. You don't listen to me. Well, and Drew will attest to it. If Drew was here with this whole Kevin Love thing, we're right back at it.
Drew will be here for our NBA lottery, or not lottery, NBA draft podcast. But he won't. He's not here. He would probably attest to that. I'll ask him when we sit down for that one. But
he might. So
the Wild aren't gonna. So they're not gonna. All the three guys I mentioned from the Wild aren't gonna get picked. Only one of them, but
that's the thing. The pick that they listed for the Wild, because they must have changed it.
Should we redo this?
They must have changed it. Was Jason Zucker? I was
talking about how the Wild could lose 7 players. No, that's not gonna happen.
Well, they're gonna lose one of them,
right?
But it is still interesting who they left unprotected.
Right. Exactly.
Here they had Jason Zucker unprotected. That was who they picked. But now with the list that we just saw, he's protected again. So Montreal, Thomas Plekanec.
So yeah, Budker is probably the guy is gone. So that's unfortunate for the Sharks. But yeah, any last thoughts before we wrap this one up?
Not really. David Perron, the St. Louis Blues, was another.
I guess
good pick that I thought.
The last thing is with these knowledge of who they might get, and we could probably talk about this more when the season begins to arrive, but with the potential of what the Vegas Knights could look like, or it's Golden Knights, right? Can we just say Vegas Knights? You think
Vegas? They should have been the Midnights. The Golden Knights.
Speaking of Drew, he going to Clarkson. They're the Golden Knights.
He commented too. He's on the Facebook Live.
Anyway, but do we see this Golden Knights team possibly being a playoff contender? Like
first year,
not necessarily a contender in the playoffs, but we saw the Nashville Predators being 18 and go on to the Stanley Cup. But we see this team possibly making the playoffs in the format that it is. I mean, which division are they going in, the Pacific or the?
I would assume the Pacific.
Okay, so that's going to be a tougher division. I feel they're both tough divisions. So
they are, and that's the thing is, I don't think that they're gonna compete for a few years because you're looking at a Pacific division.
I feel like if they do take Fleury though, I feel like he's gonna be out in a vengeance, and I could have won the Stanley Cup too, and maybe he'd have an out of his mind year. Who knows? And maybe they'd make the playoffs.
Maybe he did play. He played better than I thought he would this year, and obviously led Pittsburgh into the finals. And then obviously gets hurt and turns it over to Matt Murray, who has played fantastic hockey in his time in net in just these last 2 years. I mean, you don't get 2 Stanley Cups on accident. I know there's a lot of people who don't like the Pittsburgh Penguins. I'm one of them, but
I think there's a lot of people that don't like the Pittsburgh Penguins.
They do what they need to do, and then
they don't like the fans.
And then they've got Mike Sullivan, who's won 2 Stanley Cups in 2 years, and it's hard when you don't come to play against that kind of team. You're not going very far. But no, I don't think Las Vegas is going to compete for a few years because you're looking at a Pacific Division with the Anaheim Ducks, which I think are too strong. This is a team that doesn't necessarily have a goaltender with John Gibson and Frederick Anderson, but they still managed to have enough offense between Cam Fowler, Ricard Raquel, and Corey Perry to be able to score.
Nick Ritchie, right?
Well, he just puts an R in RV's forehead when he puts him in the board. That was probably if you get hurt, that's the kind of blood drawing injury you want. That just if you haven't seen it. Victor Arvidsson gets slammed into the boards by Nick Ritchie, which Ritchie was penalized for, but it literally created an R in the forehead of Victor Arvidsson. So it was like Nick Ritchie put his stamp on Victor Arvidsson. But
if one thing's for sure, this is an exciting process for the NHL. It's always cool to have an expansion team. If this was one of the other 3 major sports, I think this would be getting a lot more coverage and it's really fun times. If you're not into the NHL, I just really think this is fun. Expansion team was always fun. Like when the Texans came into the NFL, that was awesome when we were younger. So,
what do you think happens first? So many changes that have gone on in the NHL over the last few years. Another expansion team or another change in the playoff format?
Oh gosh, I say expansion team because I think that they're going to even this thing out in the next 3 or 4 years. But what do you think? Do you think the playoff format needs to be? I don't think it needs to be changed, but I think
I like the 1 through 8 better than the.
I think if you look at what happened this year in it was the Atlantic.
It happens every year. The Atlantic, year in and year out, is a weaker division than the Metropolitan.
Metropolitan, right? And then you had the Rangers kind of get an easier path, even though they end up falling to the Senators. Right. They didn't have to face. Columbus was forced to face Pittsburgh.
Yeah, right.
The Rangers were like, "We'll take Montreal. We don't need to face Pittsburgh first round.
Right.
We'll be fine with just Montreal."
But it happens every year. I mean, you look, the Tampa Bay Lightning made it from the Atlantic, but then had to play Montreal,
right?
And Detroit, who I know Detroit's fallen off the last few years, but the matchups are just.
But the Blackhawks can't be happy they got the Predators.
Well, exactly.
I mean, I didn't know what happening, obviously.
And that would have happened regardless, whether you did 1 through 8, whether you did the way that it is now. But it just.
But they were close to getting the Flames. They were pretty darn close to getting the Flames. They were tied in points, I believe. So.
But you're looking at a situation where each division's going to get 3 teams, and then one division could get 5, or each division is going to get 4.
Yep.
And let's face it, some of these teams, it's just not it kind of takes away from what a team's doing in the regular season. When you're playing in the more competitive division and winning all these games, trying to keep it close just to win your division, and then you're not getting rewarded for it by getting a better seed because you're seeded basically by division first and then wild card afterwards.
All right, so this was a very fun podcast, Cody. And we're gonna do our next podcast. Will be up momentarily on youtube.com/team1045 and 1045theteam.com. We're gonna talk about me, Eric Hanman, and Cody Marshall's MLB All-Stars. I know we're still a month away, but we're gonna talk about who we think should be on the All-Star team in our next podcast. And Drew Zlogar and myself will have a NBA draft preview podcast coming out soon as well. So for Cody Marshall, I'm Eric Hammond right here on 1045theteam.com. You've been listening to the Sittin Sportside podcast.